At about 5 p.m. on November 1st, 1996, 52-year-old Gary Triano stood on the 18th green at the La Paloma Country Club in Tucson, Arizona. Gary crouched down to line up a short putt, while three of his friends stood off to the side, giving him a hard time for taking so long. Gary just blocked them out. Almost everywhere else, Gary was known for being loud, impulsive, and never slowing down. But on the golf course, he always felt calm and focused. Gary stood back up and prepared to take the shot. He took a breath, brought his putter back just a little, and swung. His friends shouted like that might knock the ball off course, but Gary watched it roll across the green and drop right into the hole. Gary let out a huge yell and thrust his fist into the air in celebration. He turned to his friends and looked at them like they were crazy to think they could beat him. Gary grabbed the ball out of the hole, slipped his club into his golf bag, slung it over his shoulder, and then followed his friends into the country club bar. It was a few days before Gary's 53rd birthday, and he thought there was no better way to celebrate than with a round of golf and a drink with his friends. But what Gary didn't know was that this golf game was actually part of a bigger plan. Gary's girlfriend had arranged this game with his friends, and she'd gotten some other friends to invite him out to a different bar at 6 p.m., all so she could get Gary's house ready for a huge surprise party she was throwing him later that night. Gary and his friends took a seat at the bar and ordered some drinks. And as they did, they all bragged about the best shots they had made that day. The bartender handed Gary his drink, but before he could take a sip, he heard someone calling Mr. Triano behind him. Gary turned, and he saw a young woman in her mid-20s coming his way, and his face just lit up. It had been years since he had last seen her, but he recognized her immediately. She was one of his daughter's friends from when they were young. Gary stepped away from the bar, and the young woman hugged him like she was hugging her own father. Gary asked how she was doing, and he wanted to know all about her life. The two talked for a few minutes while Gary's friends drank at the bar. They were all very used to hearing somebody call out Gary's name no matter where they went, because it seemed like everybody in Tucson knew him. And in truth, Gary was really well known around the city. He had been a big-time real estate investor, he'd opened casinos, and he'd run businesses in a bunch of different industries. And before he'd gotten divorced from his second wife, a socialite named Pamela Phillips, they ran in the same circles as Hollywood celebrities and well-known politicians. The young woman hugged Gary again and said how great it was to see him, and she went outside as Gary made his way back to the bar. He glanced at his watch. It was almost 5:30, and so it was just about time for him to head to the next bar to meet his other group of friends. So he threw back his drink and then reached into his pocket, pulled out several bills, and carefully folded them into little origami flowers. He put these flowers on the bar for a tip, then grabbed his golf bag, shouted goodbye to everyone, and walked out. Gary's friends waved him off and then just kind of shook their heads. Gary couldn't help himself. He always had to make a grand exit. The sun was setting when Gary stepped outside, and so he looked out at the pink and red sky over the mountains and desert in the distance. It was a beautiful day, just about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and Gary smiled. It was perfect days like this that had helped the Tucson real estate market boom, and Tucson real estate had once made him millions of dollars. But now, standing there, thinking about his money, all he could do was laugh, or he'd just get depressed. Despite the continued growth of the real estate market, the last few years had been tough on Gary financially. He had spread himself too thin, investing in too many high-risk ventures, and some of the deals he'd made had completely fallen apart and cost him a huge chunk of his fortune. In order to deal with these massive losses, Gary had recently filed for bankruptcy, and now he was slowly trying to rebuild his wealth. But Gary quickly shook all of this off. From the time he was a young man, he had really believed that no matter what happened to him, he would always land on his feet. And even though he was not making the kind of money he'd made in the past, and his life wasn't as exciting as it was when he and his socialite ex-wife were hanging out with famous people, Gary still just loved being here in Tucson. He traveled all over and gone to lavish parties in some of the biggest cities in the world, but at the end of the day, nothing could beat a perfect Arizona sunset over the mountains and the desert. Gary walked across the country club parking lot to his 1989 Lincoln Town Car. He tossed his golf bag in the back and got into the driver's seat. He was about to take off when something caught his eye. There was a small wooden box in the floorboard of the passenger seat. His girlfriend must have gotten him an early birthday present and somehow hidden it in the car without him noticing until now. Gary smiled, reached down, and grabbed the box. As Gary was getting into his car, the bar inside the country club was getting louder. More people had just come in from the golf course, and everybody was talking and laughing. But suddenly, a huge bang echoed over all that noise. The glasses behind the bar rattled, and some people hit the floor, trying to take cover. They had no idea what was happening. A nearby transformer might have blown, or they could be in the middle of an earthquake. Nobody knew. But one man at the bar, who happened to be a doctor, took off running towards the parking lot, and Gary's friends and some others followed. And when they got outside, they felt like they had just stepped into a war zone. Car alarms blared, they saw smoke rising into the air, they saw cars with shattered windshields, and they saw a Lincoln Town car with its windows blown out, its doors shredded, and its roof completely ripped off. The doctor ran right to that car, hoping that nobody was inside, but as he got closer, he could see a man sprawled out in the front seat, and most of this man's clothes had been torn off his body, and he looked burned and bloody. The doctor turned around and shouted for the people who had followed him to call 911 and to stay back. He didn't know if they were all still in danger, and even if they weren't, he didn't want anyone to see what he was looking at inside of that car. The doctor leaned in through the space where the car window used to be. He reached down and grabbed the man's bloody wrist. The explosion that had shaken the bar inside must have killed this man instantly. Detective James Gamber of the Pima County Sheriff's Department was clearing the dinner table and putting dishes in the sink at his house when his phone rang. He walked across the kitchen and answered it. It was one of his colleagues from the Sheriff's Department, and this colleague said that there had just been an explosion at La Paloma Country Club, and Gamber needed to get down there right away. So Detective Gamber ran out to his car and sped off through his residential neighborhood. Gamber had only been a homicide detective with the Sheriff's Department for a short time. In fact, he had only worked one homicide case at this point. But as he drove to the country club, he had no idea if he was even heading to the scene of a murder. For all he knew, the explosion he was racing towards could have been caused by an accident of some kind. A few minutes later, Gamber pulled into the La Paloma parking lot, and he saw first responders everywhere. He also saw a different group of people, many of them in golf clothes, standing with two police officers near the main entrance of the club. The detective got out and walked over towards the first responders, and as he did, the scene in the parking lot almost didn't seem real to him. He stepped over shattered glass, and he thought he saw a car windshield stuck up in a tree, and when Gamber got to the car where the majority of first responders were and he looked inside of it, he knew he was not dealing with an accident. There was no doubt in his mind that a bomb had gone off in that car. Gamber stared down at the mangled body in the front seat. He glanced over at the first responders, and even they looked completely shaken. They had seen people who had been pulled from fires, but none of them had seen a man who had been killed by a bomb. The detective looked back at the body, and he saw something that just seemed odd. It looked like this man's clothes had been ripped off by the sheer force of the blast, but his watch had stayed on his wrist. So Gamber leaned further into the car to get a better look. The glass on the man's watch had cracked, and the watch had stopped at 5:38. And Gamber couldn't really explain it, but seeing the watch really hit him hard. It was like this man's last moment on Earth was frozen in time. Gamber stepped away from the car and walked over to the crowd of people standing out front. He briefly spoke to the other officers, and then he started taking statements from everyone. And almost all of them knew the dead man in the car, and they said his name was Gary Triano. Detective Gamber continued to gather information on Gary from the people at the club, and he learned a little about Gary's current girlfriend and what people called Gary's larger-than-life attitude. As Gamber wrote everything down in his notebook, he heard sirens blaring and cars and vans speeding down the street towards the parking lot. He looked out onto the street, and he quickly realized this case was about to get a lot bigger than anything he'd ever worked on. Because most of the vehicles heading this way did not belong to the Pima County Sheriff's Department or the local police. They belonged to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And within minutes, Gamber watched as federal agents from the FBI and ATF swarmed the parking lot and took control of the crime scene. After Gamber finished his interviews, he walked away from the club entrance, but he hung back and just watched the activity in the parking lot. This crime scene had overwhelmed him when he arrived, and now there were law enforcement officers from multiple agencies searching the lot, and forensics and explosives experts from the ATF and FBI searching Gary's car. Gamber honestly wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. Finally, amidst all of this, he spotted his boss, the Pima County Sheriff. So he weaved his way past federal agents towards Gary's car and approached the sheriff, who looked kind of overwhelmed himself. The sheriff told Gamber that several of the federal agents he'd spoken to thought there was a chance that this had been a professional mob hit. Technicians had already found fragments in and around the car that they believed were from a homemade incendiary device, and they thought this device could be the type of bomb often used by the mafia. This actually all made sense to Detective Gamber because he knew that the mafia had been prevalent in this area since back in the 1970s. But Gamber wanted to know what their department's role was in all of this. Clearly, the FBI and ATF were running things here, and if the mafia was involved, both of those agencies would probably run the entire case for a while. The sheriff said their department would coordinate with the feds, but he told Gamber that it was still the homicide unit's job to pursue this like they would any other murder case. So Gamber told his boss if the FBI and ATF were going to start looking into big-time suspects like organized crime families, then he wanted to start on a much smaller scale. And right now, that meant talking to the person who would almost always be the first suspect in a murder investigation, the victim's romantic partner. A little over an hour after the explosion, a woman stepped out of her car and approached the country club parking lot. She looked almost like she was sleepwalking, like she didn't see all the chaos around her. Local police officers immediately stopped the woman from walking any further into the parking lot, and she shouted that she was Gary's girlfriend. Detective Gamber saw this happening. He'd been waiting for her. A police officer had called her at Gary's house to inform her about what had happened. At first, she didn't believe the cop. She said Gary was out with his friends, and then he was going to come home for a huge surprise party she was throwing him. But eventually, she had accepted the truth, and she said she was coming to the country club right away. Gamber rushed over to her and introduced himself. He said how sorry he was, and he hated to put her in this position right now, but he needed to ask her some questions. Gary's girlfriend looked back at him, still with this glazed expression, and said she would try to help. Gamber glanced down at a few notes he'd scribbled in his notebook. He knew the doors on Gary's car had been so badly damaged by the blast that it was impossible to tell if someone had broken into the car to plant the bomb. But people had been in and out of the parking lot all day, and so far, nobody had reported witnessing a break-in. So, Gamber thought there was a good chance that whoever planted the bomb had easy access to Gary's car, so he asked Gary's girlfriend if she had keys to the Lincoln. She said she did, but she said it didn't really make a difference because Gary always left his car unlocked. This threw Gamber off. Somebody leaving their car unlocked, especially a nice car like Gary's, sounded like something that only happened back in the 1950s. But Gary's girlfriend said that he had this foolish belief that nothing bad would ever happen to him, and that people were actually good at heart. She said if it wasn't for her, he very likely would have just left his house unlocked every night. Gamber continued to talk to Gary's girlfriend for a few more minutes. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but this woman really did seem completely shocked by Gary's death. So he told her before he let her go that he just wanted to know if she could think of anyone in Gary's life who might have wanted to harm him. Gary's girlfriend shook her head. She said Gary had a good relationship with both of his ex-wives and his 2 grown children from his first marriage, and the children from his second marriage were still pretty little, and she said everybody who knew Gary loved him. He was generous and fun. Suddenly, Gary's girlfriend trailed off, and the look on her face totally changed, like she had just thought of something. Gamber asked if something was wrong, and she nodded. There was one past relationship in Gary's life that had ended badly, and it just continued to get worse. She said Gary had an ex-girlfriend named Robin Gardner, and Gary had left her when she got pregnant. But even before that, Gary had wanted to get out of the relationship because Robin had a temper and had once attacked him with a flower vase. Gamber asked if Gary had had any contact with Robin lately. Gary's girlfriend said that Robin had called a few months earlier, and she left Gary a message on the machine. And all Robin had said was, "You're going to pay. Someday, you're going to pay." The day following the bombing, FBI and ATF agents remained focused on possible mob ties to Gary's murder, while Detective Gamber drove to meet Gary's ex-girlfriend, Robin, at her house. By this time, the bombing was all over the news in the region, so Robin was well aware that Gary had died. Robin opened the door, holding her baby girl in her arms, and she led the detective into the kitchen, where her new husband was already sitting at the table. Gamber took a seat, and he didn't waste any time. He said he knew that Robin had once physically assaulted Gary because Gary had called 911 and asked police to remove her from his house. Gamber also knew about the threatening phone message she had left him. Robin's face immediately turned red, and she looked very embarrassed. She said she couldn't justify her actions, but Gamber clearly did not have the full story. When she had gotten pregnant, Gary had openly doubted that the baby was his. He broke up with her and didn't want any responsibility for the child, so she lashed out because she was hurt and scared and didn't know if she'd be able to provide for her baby on her own. But after the baby was born and a paternity test proved that she was Gary's daughter, Gary had said he would help take care of her financially, and Robin and Gary's relationship became a lot more civil. The baby started crying a little, and Robin asked if she could excuse herself. Gamber said of course, and Robin carried the baby out of the kitchen. Her husband watched to make sure she was out of earshot, and then he leaned toward Gamber and spoke quietly. He said there was no doubt that his wife had a temper. If Robin was mad, she made it really clear. But despite the issues she'd had with Gary, Robin's husband said that she told him that Gary was a good man for admitting he was wrong and doing his part to make sure the baby was taken care of. By the time Gamber left the house, he didn't feel like Gary's ex-girlfriend or his latest girlfriend were the likely killers. He didn't want to eliminate any suspects until he had more clear evidence, but he knew Gary's ex-wives and his grown children could also have a motive to kill Gary. And all of them most likely knew about Gary's strange habit of keeping his car doors unlocked, so they would know how easy it would be to place a bomb in the Lincoln town car. During the week following the bombing, Detective Gamber checked in often with the sheriff and with the FBI and ATF. The feds were still tracking leads connected to the mafia, and they were delving deep into Gary's financial records. It had become clear that Gary had racked up millions of dollars in debt, and he owed people money all over the world, so they were even following international leads. But all of the agencies believed Detective Gamber's investigation held just as much weight as theirs. It was still entirely possible that Gary's murder was personal and had nothing to do with his business dealings. So Gamber arranged separate interviews with Gary's two ex-wives, but both of these meetings played out almost exactly the same way. All Gary's first wife, Mary, and his second wife, the socialite Pamela, really told Gamber was that they loved Gary, thought he was a great father, and they had remained good friends with him after their divorces. They were also both heartbroken by Gary's death. After meeting Mary and Pamela, Detective Gamber did not feel like he had any new information about the case, and he was already starting to get frustrated. Gary's somewhat tangled romantic life had seemed like a strong lead, but his relationships with his ex-wives appeared to have both been pretty healthy. And even as Gary had started to struggle financially, he always paid his child support, so that was not a cause for conflict. And Gamber also had to admit that both women had really solid alibis. Neither of them had been in town when Gary died. Following the meetings with the ex-wives, Gamber interviewed Gary's son and daughter from his first marriage, who were both in their mid-20s, and he hoped they would give him something to go on. But they would both say that Gary was a great dad and an amazing friend. He meant everything to them. They admitted that when they were teenagers and their parents got divorced, they had blamed their dad at first, but they ended up loving their stepmom and their two little half-siblings, so any animosity they felt towards their dad had disappeared. And so in about the span of a week, Gamber had met with the people he believed had the clearest personal motives to kill Gary, but he felt like he still hadn't gotten anywhere. At the same time, the federal investigations also seemed to be stalling. There were plenty of leads, but each one of them fell apart under the slightest bit of scrutiny. So, as November came to an end, everyone involved in the hunt for Gary's killer worried that the case was already drying up, and that the killer, who had set off a homemade bomb in the city of Tucson, would remain free and out on the streets. In early December, about a month after Gary's murder, Detective Gamber got a phone call at his desk. And as soon as the man on the line began talking, Gamber could hear the urgency in his voice. The man said he was an investigator from Aspen, Colorado. He'd just seen a news report about Gamber's ongoing investigation, and he had some strange pieces of evidence that he thought might be connected to the car bombing. When Gamber heard this, he felt like he'd just woken up after a long night of sleep. This was the first time he'd been excited about this case in weeks. The Colorado investigator said he'd been working a fraud case for months, trying to track down a man named Ron Young. Ron had bilked a bunch of people out of thousands of dollars. And back in October, this investigator had found an abandoned minivan in California that Ron had rented. Inside the van, the investigator said he'd found a sawed-off shotgun. He'd also found some potential evidence that he didn't really understand at the time. But after seeing the news report about this car bombing, he thought that evidence he found might finally make sense. Gamber was now standing up at his desk, just waiting with anticipation to hear what this evidence was. The investigator said he had found a map of Tucson, Arizona, and a piece of paper with some names on it. And one of those names was Gary Triano. Gamber felt his hands shaking. He wanted to run out of the station and go find Ron Young right away. So he asked the investigator to please send over all the information he had on him. The investigator said he would do that as soon as they hung up, but he gave Gamber a warning. He said Ron was elusive, and tracking him down would not be easy. Throughout the end of 1996 and the first several months of 1997, Detective Gamber worked with the FBI to try to locate Ron. But after months of searching, Gamber started to feel like the investigator from Colorado had made a huge understatement. Ron was not just elusive, this man was a ghost. None of Ron's family or friends, or anyone he knew, seemed to have any idea where he was. He might as well have just dropped off the face of the earth. And even with Gamber and the FBI coordinating with state and local authorities across the country, they could not get a viable lead on Ron's location. During this time, the other aspects of the investigation had also hit a wall, and so even the federal agencies believed that finding Ron was their only real option for keeping the case going. But as more time went by and they still could not find Ron, Gamber started to get the sick feeling that Gary's killer would never be found and his family would never get closure. And for Gamber, who was still so new to the homicide unit, this felt like a total failure. And by early summer of 1997, about 7 months after Gary's murder, there was still no sign of Ron, and Detective Gamber's fears came true. The interagency task force that had been working on the case disbanded. The feds left, and Gary's murder was no longer considered a top priority for the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Gamber did his best to try to return to the case files whenever he could, but he soon had other homicide investigations to lead. And then Gary's murder almost completely disappeared from the news, and the case went cold for a very long time. On November 19, 2005, 9 years after Gary's murder, a chiropractor in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, came home after a day of work, sat down on his couch, and turned on one of his favorite TV shows, America's Most Wanted. At the time, America's Most Wanted was a very popular show that featured stories about criminals who were still at large, in the hope that the viewers of the show might provide tips that could help lead to an arrest. The chiropractor watched the show and listened to a story about a man who was wanted in a fraud case and had possible connections to a murder. And as the chiropractor watched, he suddenly got off the couch and got closer to his TV to make sure he was really seeing what he thought he was seeing. There was an image of the criminal on the screen. Now, the chiropractor didn't recognize the criminal's name, Ron Young, but he definitely recognized the man, because he had treated this man's bad back on several different occasions. The chiropractor grabbed his cell phone from his pocket and dialed the number for the America's Most Wanted tip line. 2 days later, federal and local law enforcement arrested Ron Young in Fort Lauderdale. And days after that, Detective Gamber, who was still a homicide detective, along with other Pima County investigators, flew to Florida to question Ron in connection to the bombing that killed Gary Triano. Detective Gamber felt exhilarated to have the case reopened. He had always regretted that he had not been able to bring Gary's killer to justice, but Gamber would soon realize that he still had a long way to go. Ron repeatedly denied having anything to do with Gary's murder, no matter how much police pressured him. And so it would take several more years of coordinated efforts between law enforcement organizations across the country and multiple international agencies for investigators to gather evidence to prove that Ron knew a lot more than he was willing to say, and that there was someone else out there on the run who was directly connected to Gary's murder. 4 years later, on a cold December night in Vienna, Austria in 2009, now 13 years after Gary's murder, members of Austria's federal police force approached an upscale hotel located in one of the wealthiest parts of the city. The lead officer and his partner found the room they were looking for and knocked on the door. When the door opened, the lead officer spoke in German, but the person at the door looked confused. So the officer quickly switched to English and asked them to identify themselves. And when the lead officer heard this person's name, he told them that they were under arrest for the murder of Gary Triano. Soon after this arrest, the lead officer contacted his supervisor, who then got in touch with federal authorities in the United States to start the extradition process. That process took months, but when the suspect was back in Arizona, Detective Gamber interviewed them. And by the time that interview ended, all of Gamber's hard work had finally paid off. After 13 years, he now knew who had murdered Gary. Based on evidence collected over the course of the entire investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Gary on November 1st, 1996. At around 4:15 p.m. that day, the bomber sat at a small table in a hotel room, breathing in slowly over and over until they could feel their heart rate slowing down. When they felt completely calm, they reached out, picked up the homemade bomb they had spent days putting together, and then slowly placed it into an open wooden box laying on the table. They secured the bomb inside the box, and then walked across the room and grabbed the phone. They took a small piece of paper out of their pocket with a number scrawled on it and dialed. A friendly young man at the front desk of the La Paloma Country Club answered and asked how he could help. The bomber, using an equally friendly voice, asked the young man if Gary Triano was out on the golf course. The young man said he was. He said he had welcomed Gary into the club a little while earlier. After that, the bomber hung up the phone and walked back to the table, picked up the box with the bomb in it, and walked out to their car. They set the box in the passenger seat and then drove slowly down the road. No need to take any stupid chances by driving fast. A few minutes later, the bomber pulled into the La Paloma parking lot. They spotted Gary's Lincoln Town car and pulled into a spot that was as far away as they could get while still maintaining a clear view of Gary's car. The bomber scanned the lot and they didn't see anyone. So they opened their car door, went around to the other side, and carefully picked up the box with the bomb inside of it. They kept their head down as they walked to Gary's car. When they got there, they saw that the passenger side door was unlocked. They opened the door, crouched down, and placed the box on the floorboard. The bomber closed Gary's car door and quickly walked back to their car and climbed inside. And then they watched and waited. At around 5:30 p.m., they saw Gary step out of the country club. The bomber reached into their pocket and slipped out a small remote control. As they watched Gary get closer to his car, their heartbeat got faster. Gary climbed into his car, and after a second, the bomber watched as Gary leaned down towards the floorboard. And at that moment, the bomber hit a button on that remote. The bomber heard a loud bang and saw the roof of Gary's car go flying into the air. In the chaos, the bomber sped out of the parking lot and drove to a nearby payphone. They dropped a coin in, and when the person answered, the bomber said the job was done. The person on the other side of the call didn't say anything. They just hung up the phone and smiled at their two little children who were playing nearby. Ron Young, the man who had eluded authorities for years before getting caught by a chiropractor watching TV, built the bomb and placed it inside of Gary's car. But Ron was not the person who had set any of this in motion. Gary's second wife, the socialite Pamela Phillips, was the one behind everything. It turned out that despite what Pamela had told the police, she was not happy about her relationship with her ex-husband. Because ever since Gary had begun experiencing financial difficulties, he stopped giving Pamela the type of money he had given her in the past. Gary still paid child support and alimony, but there was nothing extra for her like there used to be. And so Pamela had decided that the only way she could get the kind of money from Gary that she wanted was by killing him. Because Gary had taken out a $2 million life insurance policy, and he had made Pamela and his two kids the beneficiaries. But until those kids turned 18, Pamela would receive the payout if Gary died, with the understanding that she would manage and invest the money for the kids. But Pamela just wanted the money for herself and did not want to wait any longer. So she offered a man she'd once had a romantic relationship with, Ron Young, $400,000 to do the job. Ron already had a criminal past, and he had some experience with explosives. So together, Pamela and Ron started planning Gary's murder, and they decided to use a homemade bomb. And in the fall of 1996, they found the perfect way to carry out their plan. Gary's girlfriend had wanted everyone in Gary's family to come to the surprise party she was planning. So she had invited Pamela and the kids, and even told Pamela her plan to keep Gary out of the house. He was going to play golf at La Paloma until around 5:30, and then go to another bar before coming home. So, Pamela now had the perfect time and place for Ron to pull off the murder. She knew exactly where Gary was going to be, and she knew Gary never locked his car doors, so Ron would have no problem finding the car and planting the bomb. This all took years for Detective Gamber and investigators to put together, mainly because Ron had been so difficult to hunt down and to get any information from. But when they finally had him in custody and started getting closer to connecting Pamela to the murder, she took off to Europe. It took a while, but eventually, law enforcement agencies in Austria found her staying at a high-end hotel in Vienna. So they arrested her and sent her back to the United States. Ron Young and Pamela Phillips were both found guilty of murder and conspiracy. Ron received 2 life sentences without possibility of parole. Pamela received life in prison plus 25 years, also with no possibility of parole. And because of the amount of time this investigation took, it was both Detective Gamber's second homicide case and his last. He retired from the force not long after having helped solve Gary's murder.
They start to dance, oh yeah, in this timeless romance. Every glance a sweet refrain, together we'll remain, remain, remain. Moonlight glow, so bright, so true. Hey, hey, shining down on me and you. In your eyes I see the spark, love ignites here in the dark, dark. The dark. Dance, dance under the stars, hearts align, near and far. Feel the rhythm, feel the light.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you like today's story and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all our studio's podcasts. They are this one, the MrBallen podcast. We also have Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime